So Cali came to me 2 years before I actually
Hey folks, thanks very much for tuning in. I hope you're all healthy and loving life. So welcome back if you've been following along, and hello if you're new. Please do like the video and share it on social media if you can, because it gets the word out there. And the more it's shared, the more it's seen, and the more people can see what's going on. So there's been quite a bit of stuff happening in the last few days relating to the Shaun Attwood PR machine. We've had the James English podcast with Darren G, part 3, in which Mr. Attwood was once again eviscerated by Darren G. Some people say that Darren is making accusations without evidence. I'm going to get into that in a little bit. Then we've got the Marvin Herbert interview. Masterclass in clickbait that was. Genuinely, the amount of subscribers he got out of that. Obviously, the first episode was nothing like the trailer, which I knew was going to be the case, but to be fair to Marvin, he is going harder on Shaun Attwood than most people have in the past. I think they are friends though. Marvin's co-host certainly is one of Shaun Attwood's friends. Obviously, the trailer over-promised, and the reaction to the first episode says it all, but this might be just about playing the YouTube game. Sometimes a gamble pays off, sometimes it doesn't. We'll see which way it goes. My mind is open at the moment on this one as to whether we'll get anything new out of it. We've also had another former Shaun Attwood guest called Yami B claiming that Shaun Attwood messed him around in the background over his book. Very similar in fact to what happened to Darren G. Now, Yami B did delete his video, so maybe he retracts what he said, I don't know, but it was quite an emotive video. He was obviously quite upset, and he had obviously been messed around by Shaun Attwood quite badly in the background and was not happy about it. But Mr. Attwood has obviously been in the background since Yami's video went out, because Yami's video suddenly came down after Shaun Attwood had supposedly been blanking him for several months and treating him like a mug. He's now posting that he's having dinner with Yami. So make of that what you will. And then of course we've got the True Geordie Podcast, which is mainly what we're going to go over in this video. So I'm going to assume first of all that most people watching are familiar with the Daddygate video, but because there's quite a few new subscribers, I just want to outline that this refers to a video which Shaun Attwood filmed, the 53-year-old author and abuse activist. He filmed a young woman who uses the pseudonym Cali, and he filmed her on her knees in front of him. The problem with this is, first of all, that Cali was a former podcast guest of Mr. Attwood, who was presented as having gone to him for help and was presented as an extremely vulnerable person in imminent danger from human traffickers, and she was a victim of years of abuse. And also the fact that the video actually recreated abuse that she had described as suffering when she was a child. She mentioned this on an episode of Mr. Attwood's podcast. Then in the background, she's on his knees calling him daddy and unzipping his trousers while she's dressed in a daddy's little girl outfit, according to Mr. Attwood himself. So this was obviously highly inappropriate, and then several nude photographs of the same person posing in explicit positions in Shaun Attwood's home were also uncovered. These photographs were uncovered on an active escort profile in which Cali was advertising her services for £1,200 a night, which had actually still been getting reviews from paying customers by the looks of things. Now, all this was going on in the background whilst Mr. Attwood presented Cali to his audience in a series of podcasts as a vulnerable victim. There was also a GoFundMe set up for her to get her rehoused, and all kinds of stuff while this was going on. So that is the gist of Daddygate. It's not about kink shaming, as some people seem to think it is. It's about how inappropriate the situation is as a whole, when somebody in Mr. Attwood's position, who positions himself as an abuse campaigner and an activist at the forefront of exposing abuse, he goes and carries out something like this in the background and then tries to explain it away as a prank. This was all exposed by another YouTuber, and he claimed it was all just a prank. But he did later admit that he had taken advantage of a trafficked vulnerable person and made her recreate her abuse, causing further trauma to her.
I took advantage of a trafficked, vulnerable person reenacting this, and it made him relive it, and it probably traumatized that person. I completely agree with that. Shouldn't have done it, and they are 100% right about that.
Now, he also tried to claim recently that this Daddy video was not a prank, but a mission, because he changes his story all the time. So he tried to say that this was a mission, that Cali was working on a project, it was to assist abuse survivors. He repeated this a few times in a few different sources, but he's now gone back to saying that it was a prank on the True Geordie podcast. So I think this is now his official narrative. So on to the True Geordie podcast itself then. True Geordie is made up of Brian and Lawrence, and I have to say, I don't know what they were thinking. Maybe they didn't expect the stuff to be said that was said, but they did go along with it quite happily, so it's hard not to think that they were in on it from the start, but this was an astonishingly weird interview. It was set up as a tribute to Wildman, of course, Shaun Attwood's lifelong best friend who recently died. And obviously, it was set up this way to get maximum views. A Wildman tribute on the True Geordie channel, it sounded like a bit of an event. It was guaranteed to get clicks. I have to ask myself why Shaun wouldn't have done it on his own channel, with it being a Wildman tribute, even with a host if he needed somebody else there. And the reason is that it wasn't really a Wildman tribute. This was a PR campaign. It was designed to look like a tribute to Wildman to maximise the clicks and the attention and the likes, those Insta likes that people will give something like that. But it was all designed to improve Shaun Attwood's reputation. He doesn't need to do that on his own channel because all of this has been completely hidden from his own subscribers. Most of his casual subscribers don't have a clue about any of this. But if you go off into other channels on YouTube, then loads of people know about it. And that's the reason he's trying to control the narrative to a different section of the YouTube audience. And he's using Wildman's death as an opportunity to improve his reputation. As far as I'm aware, True Geordie also don't really do YouTube that much anymore either. They've started focusing on Twitch with a deal. A lot of their content is exclusive to Twitch now, and it just seems odd that they would return to YouTube to put out this for Shaun Attwood. It certainly, to me, just seemed like a PR fluff piece, and it looked as if they'd just been paid to do it. And we know that they certainly do enjoy money, the True Geordie guys. They often talk about business and money, things that they need to do to maximise their profit, etc, etc. So we know they do like a bit of cash. Wouldn't surprise me at all if Shaun Attwood had paid them a bit of cash to do this. A couple of things gave the game away that it wasn't about Wildman. At the very start of the video, Shaun says he's hoping that they can relaunch him.
You guys, I have credited over and over again for launching my YouTube. And I'm hoping coming on here today is going to help me relaunch because I've not been able to pick up a camera since Wildman died.
Which is a very strange word to use on a tribute to your best mate. And Brian from True Geordie said that they were happy to help him out as he's helped them out.
And to be honest, like if you hadn't asked to do this, I would have never suggested it. If you're feeling like you need a bit of a jump start, we're more than happy to help. You helped us.
So that was quite odd. Mr. Attwood also turned up with what he called paperwork. And the paperwork was apparently letters from the Home Office proving that this girl, Cali, is indeed an extremely vulnerable person who has been trafficked. Now, this was obviously done to add some credibility to Mr. Attwood's story, and he passed the paperwork to the True Geordie guys, who nodded in approval, basically that in their expert position and opinion this was legitimate, I suppose. But it was obviously done just to satisfy the people who doubt Cali's backstory. But the issue is the camera was not showing the paperwork, so we're just meant to believe that this paperwork is authentic because True Geordie have looked at it on camera. And why is Mr. Attwood handing out such sensitive documents that belong to another person anyway? If we're to believe Cali, and you probably know my thoughts on Cali, you can check out my Cali Diamond Show video down below. I'll put a link if I remember. But if we're to believe Cali in this regard anyway, she says she doesn't get along with Shaun Attwood now. So what the hell is he doing passing out paperwork relating to her trauma and her abuse, personal confidential paperwork? What's he doing handing it out to podcast hosts anyway? And how are they supposed to ascertain whether those are genuine documents or the seriousness of what they actually purport to show? If Mr. Attwood is so keen on showing people sensitive paperwork, I would like him to provide the police report from the evening where Cali allegedly attempted to end her life in his home shortly after moving in with him, because something doesn't sit right with me regarding that, and I'd like to know what actually went on. And he himself said that the police know what went on and that will prove everything, but he's never come up with paperwork, as he likes to call it, in relation to that. So I would like Mr. Attwood to find the police report, request it, whatever, and then provide that to people so we can see what actually happened that night that she attempted to end her life in his home.
Cali tried to kill herself at my place last night.
So straight off the bat, we've got Shaun Attwood saying that he's there to be relaunched. We've got Brian from True Geordie saying they are doing it because he's helped them out before. So there's some kind of arrangement in place. And then we have him showing paperwork that proves absolutely nothing. We've also got Brian mentioning very casually that Shaun Attwood has bipolar disorder.
You yourself have bipolar.
I was diagnosed with that, yeah.
And the reason they slipped this in is supposedly to ask if Wildman had it. Now, does that not just seem like quite an odd thing to do, to blithely bring up someone's crippling mental health condition, which, by the way, Mr. Attwood never talks about publicly, just to lead into a question about the person's dead friend on a tribute? That doesn't add up. That clearly, to me, looks as if it's been slipped in because it was discussed before they went on that they would get that in there, slipped in to provide a nice little excuse or a partial explanation for Shaun Attwood's behaviour. Just a way to minimise his behaviour, that's all that was. That's my opinion, of course, but I don't think mental health conditions should be brought up like that. It's pretty much the old YouTube classic excuse of I was in a dark place, so I did everything I wanted to satisfy my own ego for a long time and then got caught. This is clearly a complete PR fluff piece for Shaun Attwood, and to do it as a Wildman tribute is bad taste, to say the least. Although it was dressed up as a Wildman tribute for the audience, at least for the first half of the show, they kinda stuck to that theme, but it was a 2.5 hour long podcast, and most casual viewers, more than half of them really, will drop off before the halfway point of a podcast that's that long. And lo and behold, come the halfway point, they suddenly stopped talking about Wildman and suddenly started talking about the Daddygate scandal. They also talked about Shaun Attwood's alleged trolls. He also fired shots at his former employer, Brand YouTube, and for some reason there was an awful lot of talk about Shaun Attwood's anus and the kind of things which excite him in that regard. And True Geordie humoured him quite enthusiastically throughout the whole thing. At least they gave that impression anyway. So for those people who are watching this as a tribute to Wildman, many of whom commented that they were in tears over this tribute, those who stayed on past the 90-ish minute mark, they were suddenly bombarded with complete filth, and it escalated very quickly, and numerous people said it actually put them off their food. So the talk about Mr. Attwood's back door, if we can put it like that, and bear in mind, this is a 50-something-year-old man here. He might not look it due to all the Botox, but he is. All this graphic talk was down to his attempts to discredit an ex-partner of his who just so happened to be the source of the initial leak, which resulted in the Daddygate scandal happening in the first place. So he's obviously wanting to discredit this person. Now, I'm not a prude by any stretch of the imagination, but I've never heard so much grotesque filth in my life, especially so unexpectedly. Mr. Attwood was very excited and animated, and he spoke at length about his anatomy, about using tools on it, about the size of his back door, about the ex-partner's mouth being used for certain things, about her injuring him so hard that he would leak. He went into the messy after effects, leakages in the car home, blood in the toilet, that kind of thing. Just stuff that makes you wince. He also said they wanted to have a threesome with an AI sex doll, just bizarre stuff. It was basically coke talk, the kind of thing that you'd regale a bunch of wasters with at 4 o'clock in the morning at a party and get a lot of laughs at that point, just trying to be as edgy as possible, but with nobody outside of that situation finding it entertaining or interesting whatsoever. And it's a complete understatement to say that this was inappropriate to talk about in a tribute to your recently deceased friend, whose own friends and family were obviously going to be watching.
I'm down with the anal G-spot with a finger in there or something, but I don't want my ass made into a cavern.
Really no consideration for the people watching for Wildman at all.
I'm down with the anal G-spot with a finger in there or something, but I don't want my ass made into a cavern.
True Geordie played along with it. I could tell at some points they were maybe taken aback slightly. I don't think it was pre-rehearsed in this regard, but they were certainly asking him questions about it, asking about toys. It kind of looked to me as if they'd just been paid by Mr. Attwood and told to go along with whatever he said. I cannot imagine why else they would have indulged him on this one, but they did. And this was all done, as I say, to discredit this ex-partner. So I don't think True Geordie has actually come out of this smelling of roses, if you'll excuse the expression. What have we learned so far then? We've learned that Shaun Attwood will shift from crying about his dead friend to talking about being rammed from behind, is a sex-obsessed and emotionally stunted man-child who doesn't know how anecdotes work or how to read an audience. He thinks nothing of trying to discredit an ex-partner by talking about their supposed bedroom life, and he thinks if you bring a sex doll into the bedroom that constitutes a threesome. I don't know who's going to tell him that that is not a threesome, but somebody has to. He can't go on through life, especially at his age, thinking that that equals a threesome. And we also learned that he's got no consideration for the family of Wildman, who are grieving for their recently deceased father, brother, uncle, etc. And were almost certainly hoping to watch something being put out into the world about him by his famous best mate, and they get this crap. No compassion at all. He also said on this massive show with a very large audience that the ex that he's talking about has a stalker, but then he says he'll show the True Geordie guys a photograph of her afterwards. So his moral compass appears to be completely broken. Now, Mr. Attwood himself complains that people cannot be called predators without paperwork, yet he does the exact same thing talking about this ex, and he says that she was known by all his friends as the arse rapist. So he's trying to discredit the initial source of the leak by effectively shaming her for things they did in private. He also targets Brand YouTube in this video, which is a website which used to employ Mr. Attwood until they realised that there was no real explanation for why a 53-year-old sex abuse activist would film a vulnerable woman on her knees calling him daddy, mirroring the abuse that she had told him about on his podcast. So they did the right thing and they got rid of him when it dawned on them that maybe that wasn't the right thing to be supporting. And credit to Brand YouTube, they are the only organisation that acted properly at that time. We have, of course, since seen School Talks, the School Talks organisation. I think it's the biggest in the UK, who book people to go into schools and talk to children and teenagers about various things, just interesting things to do talks. They have severed ties with Shaun Attwood and blocked his route into schools, certainly via them anyway, and that was done, I believe, when people sent them the Daddygate video. So they looked at the Daddygate video and said, okay, we can't obviously allow this guy to go into schools. That's my interpretation of the situation, anyway, from what I've seen. Now, Mr. Attwood, regarding BNT, he did actually do a car crash interview on BNT, Brand YouTube, with Sonia Poulton, and he refers to this saying that Brand YouTube told him to do this interview and that they told him to admit everything. He said it was against his better judgment to admit anything, but he admitted everything because they told him to. They told him to take a grilling from Sonia so that it could be swept under the carpet, so to speak, and they said that they would take him back once it had all blown over. So he's kind of trying to blame Brand YouTube, but missing the point here that the thing he admitted to is a thing that he did. He also says that they told him not to defend himself, even though he spent the entire interview doing just that, and coming across so badly that it became known as the Prince Attwood interview, because it mirrored the Prince Andrew interview that Prince Andrew did on BBC and made a complete fool out of himself. If somebody would like to reach out to the CEO of BNT or even to Sonia Poulton for a comment on that, I would be quite keen to hear it. He also said that Sonia has discovered during her research as a high-class journalist that Black Ops style dark forces are working to bring Shaun Attwood down.
And said she has researched this and she believes there are Black Ops, agent provocateur level ops against us trying to stop all this information from getting out of there.
And that this explains the trolling that he's been receiving. And by trolling, just to be clear, he means people talking about the things that he himself did and admitted to. The thing is, True Geordie humour him on this point as well. They act as if it's perfectly sensible to presume that he's stepping on toes at the highest levels of government, exposing elite abuse, and of course people want him brought down. That's just ridiculous. It doesn't look good for True Geordie going along with this, but it just goes back to them obviously doing what they're told. Now, another thing that Mr. Attwood said was that he'd set up the GoFundMe for Cali. So this is what he said in this True Geordie interview. He said he set up the GoFundMe for Cali. This was the GoFundMe which solicited donations from his audience, the one which they said was set up to pay for Cali's housing costs. This contradicts what he said at the time though, and I was still a fan of Shaun Attwood at that point. He explicitly stated on his show that it was not set up by him. It was set up by an anonymous viewer. It was nothing to do with Shaun Attwood. But then obviously when you look at it, as everyone's noticed, it says it was set up by Cali Diamond, which is a fictional name anyway. So there's something extremely weird going on. But in this interview, Shaun Attwood says for the first time that he set up the GoFundMe for Cali.
I set up a donation page for her because she was homeless and injecting cocaine, and I've lived with...
I think the thing that annoyed me most though was the way he talked about Cali. And I'm not just saying this to defend Cali, not at all. What I'm saying is the way he talked about her abuse after everything that's gone on, I just found it to be so fake.
And my podcast guest name is Cali.
Okay.
And she suffered a horrendous story of abuse. She was molested, I think, by an uncle at age 4. Mm-hmm. She got heavily into drugs. She didn't have the tools to deal with what had happened to her. And then...
Once you see Shaun Attwood for what he is, you can't unsee it, and I do not believe he gives a damn about Cali's abuse. But he was talking about it as if he cares so much about her, going on and talking about her abuse as a child. Why would he even mention that on his podcast? This is not his story to tell to that audience. But he's still talking about it as if it brings up such emotion whilst actually taking selfies with his tongue in her mouth. And this is what I mentioned earlier about Darren G's comments. People ask if Darren G has paperwork to back up his statements that Shaun Attwood is a wrong-un, we'll put it like that. If you want to see Darren G's statements in full, you can obviously go and watch them on the James English Podcast Part 3, which is the one that was just released. And there's other videos with Darren G's comments in it as well. I've got some on my channel and there's others elsewhere. Well, it's fair to say that based on the Daddygate video alone, Darren G is absolutely fair to come to that conclusion that he has come to. But whether he's actually talking about that or he's got other information remains to be seen. But is Shaun Attwood being unfairly treated by people suggesting that he may be a predator in some way? Well, first of all, he's a successful YouTuber and author. He's got a pretty big public profile. He's got about 600,000 subscribers, and he's admitted to taking advantage of an abuse victim to make the Daddygate video. We know that. He's admitted that. He's admitted to recreating her abuse, and it's fair to assume that if he's recreating the abuse that he's been getting off on what's happened to her. She was a complete nobody. She was plucked out of obscurity by Shaun Attwood and then put on his show. Nobody knew who she was before that. And she went to him to get help getting her story out there. He's confirmed that. He said that is the case in this True Geordie interview. We also know that he photographed her naked all over his flat after she came to him for help. But why was she in his flat in the first place? Well, Shaun Attwood says that Cali had no money and nowhere else to live, and according to this True Geordie interview, he said the local council approached Shaun Attwood and asked him if he could house Cali, and he did.
The Guildford Council asked me if I would house her for a few days. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I said yeah, they were going to try and find her a house. They never did.
So she was living with him because she had nowhere else to go and no money of her own. So engaging in sexual activity, having his tongue in her mouth, reenacting her abuse, taking photographs of her in various poses all around his house, after she went to him for help and after she stayed with him seeking shelter because she's got no money, the fact that she's vulnerable, has addiction issues, and the council asked him to house her while they looked for alternative accommodation, it does come across as extremely weak-willed and unacceptable behaviour from a so-called abuse activist. And not only that, Cali has suggested that he restricts her access to her email accounts and social media accounts, and that he may even make social media posts from her accounts that praise him, posts that she doesn't agree with. He should have absolutely no access to her social media accounts in the first place. She even claims that a post which appeared to be written by her in the comments of the True Geordie video, a post which was very strangely written but gushed over Shaun Attwood, saying what a hero he is for saving her life, and went into personal details which were not necessary to be written. She's saying that that was not written by her. So she was approached for comment about that, and she said she doesn't know who wrote it, but it wasn't her, and it's somebody that has access to her account, which she says Shaun does. And she also wrote, "Shaun's a liar," shortly after this other post went up. So this post went up, which she confirmed she did not write, and then 15 minutes or so later she wrote "Shaun's a liar" in a comment using the same account. Why would she write "Shaun's a liar" after that other post appeared if she didn't think it was anything to do with him? And if he does have access to her social media accounts and is using them in this way, it is getting a lot more sinister by the day. And when all this is taken into account, especially with his admission that he's taken advantage of her, and Cali has confirmed engaging in sexual activity with him, then it's my opinion that this behaviour could be classed as predatory. And when you hear this kind of thing, it really does make me wonder again what really happened that night that Mr. Attwood called the police, the night that Cali allegedly tried to end her own life shortly after moving in with him. What was that about? So there are a lot of other things that come up in this video as well, but I really just wanted to go over the things that I consider to be fairly solid at the moment without making this video too long. Basically though, for a PR stunt, this whole thing was a train wreck. It was a terrible idea and it was executed horribly with the assistance of True Geordie, unfortunately. There are a lot of likes on the podcast episode, but that's because it's the Wildman tribute. It was never going to fail to receive a massive amount of instant impulse likes. Now maybe you think I'm being harsh on Mr. Attwood, but I wouldn't accept this kind of behaviour from anyone. Just imagine that any other public figure did exactly what he's done. He's shown himself up as someone who opportunistically uses his friend's death to benefit himself. He's pulled some strings to get on a massive podcast in order to improve his own flagging reputation, and it's all just been done to give himself that nice easy line of debunked everything on True Geordie, even though he hasn't. Anyway folks, that's my take on the True Geordie podcast. There's a lot of stuff, like I say, that I wasn't able to cover or touch on, but don't forget that me and Wheezy have started the Daddygate podcast. Wheezy from the What Is Truth podcast and myself, we've teamed up and we're doing the Daddygate podcast, so we can talk about all those things on there, all the things that don't make it into videos and things like that. We also talk about other stuff too, not just Daddygate. It's quite a good time. Episode 1 is up now, so you can go over there and subscribe. Episode 2 will be coming soon, so hit the bell over there so that you get notified of that episode coming out. If you're stuck around this far, thank you very much. Please hit the like button, please subscribe if you're not already, please share this on social media, and please utilise the comment section and post your own opinion. Look out for Shaun Attwood in there making legal threats. It would not be the first time he's done that. All I'll say is that this video fully complies with the rules of fair use and is Florida produced. So thanks very much for tuning in folks. Thanks to everyone who provides me information as well. You are all a godsend. I appreciate all of you. I hope everyone listening has a lovely weekend, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers folks.